Thank you for joining us for our presentation entitled Leveraging Knowledge Graphs to Update Scientific Word Embeddings Using Latent Semantic Imputation. My name is Edward Stevenson, and I'm going to explain why we're interested in how we can update scientific word embeddings using knowledge graphs, how we're tackling the problem, and how we're evaluating our approach. For the second half of this presentation, I will hand over to my colleague Jason Hirscher-Obermeier, who is going to present our main experiment and results. First things first, our goal is to obtain high-quality word embeddings. Specifically, we are interested in word embeddings for the scientific domain. Often when training embeddings, there are important words in the scientific domain for which it is important to obtain good embeddings. For example, in chemistry, the most significant words, such as the name of a newly discovered molecule, could be very rare in any text corpus, and therefore training algorithms may ignore them and not be able to generate reliable embeddings. Words can also be missing if the embedding was trained before the terminology was introduced in the literature. For example, you could have an embedding model trained pre-COVID, and it would not have any COVID-related terms that may be useful in your downstream task. What if we could use knowledge graphs to complement the information contained in the word embedding training corpus to address these issues with rare or out-of-vocabulary terminology? We hypothesize that knowledge graphs are a good source of complementary information because they are both carefully curated in that they contain reliable information about rare terms and are often continuously updated. So, what we're interested in is researching whether we can impute these missing terms into a pre-existing embedding and leverage knowledge graphs in the process. An interesting paper from 2019 introduced a process called latent semantic imputation, which imputed embedding words into one embedding space, called the semantic space, from another embedding space, called the domain space. Whilst in their paper, they used a domain space trained from a numeric data matrix, we were interested whether we could instead use a knowledge graph. Knowledge graphs are prevalent in scientific fields, as they serve as a means to organize and store scientific data, as well as to aid downstream tasks such as reasoning and exploration. Their structure and ability to represent different relationship types make it relatively easy to integrate new data, meaning they can evolve to reflect changes in a field and as new data becomes available. They are also highly reliable sources of information, since they are typically expert curated. I'll briefly summarize the latent semantic imputation algorithm before going into our experiment. LSI can be used to create or impute word embedding vectors in a semantic space for a new word, using an embedding of that word in a domain-specific space. LSI achieves the imputation as a weighted average over existing word embedding vectors, with the weights derived from a separate domain-specific feature matrix. This approach is inspired by a dimensionality reduction technique known as locally linear embedding. The weights are calculated in the LSI algorithm in the following steps, as shown in the diagram. The starting point is the domain-specific embedding space. By assumption, it contains embeddings both for terms which are also embedded in the semantic space, as well as terms for which we want to impute. In step 2, we use the mutual distances in the domain-specific space to compute a minimum spanning tree. Then, to ensure that a minimum number of terms contribute to the final weighted average, we add k nearest neighbors, where k is a hyperparameter of the algorithm. Step 4 minimizes the L2 distance between the domain vector and a weighted average over its neighbors in the k nearest neighbor minimum spanning tree, using non-negative least squares. This gives the weights. These weights are now used to impute the missing embedding vectors in the semantic space. I make two notes here. Firstly, that the procedure relies on the existence of words with good representations in both the semantic space and domain space, referred to as anchor terms. And secondly, that the procedure does not presuppose that the two spaces have the same dimensionality. Given this as a starting point, we formulate an experiment to answer two questions. Firstly, do the embeddings imputed using LSI encode semantic similarity and relatedness information as judged by domain experts? And secondly, can the imputed embeddings be reliably used alongside the original non-imputed word embeddings? We present the results from an experiment in which we focus on the biomedical domain, which is rife with rare but significant words, use the LSI algorithm, as described before, to impute word embedding vectors for missing words. We use the medical subject headings knowledge graph, known as MESH, to obtain the domain-specific data. MESH is an expert-curated, continuously updated, large knowledge base of medical and biomedical terminology. We evaluate the quality of the resulting embeddings using the UMN SRS word pairs similarity dataset, which I'll explain in the next slide. The UMN SRS dataset is commonly used to evaluate the quality of biomedical word embeddings. It consists of 566 pairs of medical terms that have been given a relatedness and similarity score by a number of healthcare professionals. So some examples can be seen on the table on the right-hand side. To be able to compare performance on imputed and trained terms, we split the words in UMN SRS into two groups of roughly the same size. One group, which we call the trained words, are obtained directly from the word embedding training and so exist in the semantic space. A second group, which we call the imputed words, are excluded from the word embedding training and instead obtained via latent semantic imputation. The evaluation process consists of computing the cosine similarity of each word pair using the embedding vectors of the two terms, and then correlating the embedding-based similarity with the human annotated similarity scores. For this, we use the Pearson coefficient to measure the strength of the correlation. This split of the words in the UMN SRS test set results in three subsets of word pairs. The trained-trained subset, where both words result from word embedding training. The imputed subset, where both words come from the imputation procedure. And finally, the imputed trained subset, where one word was imputed and the other trained regularly. The table here shows how many word pairs end up in each of the categories for the two different test sets. And as you can see, the size of these subsets is one of the biggest caveats of our experiment. And the selection of words into the different categories cannot be entirely random, because the selection must obey the constraints that every imputed word can be found in MESH, and that every trained word can be found in our word embedding training corpus. I will now hand over to Yason to take you through our methodology and results.
Thank you, Ed. Now that we've selected the words which we want to train and the words which we want to impute, we can train the word embedding model for our experiments. We first prepare a training corpus containing around 74 million sentences from open access publications on PubMed. We then filter this corpus by removing any sentences containing one of the words which we want to impute to simulate an out-of-vocab situation. This filtering removes around 3% of sentences. We then train a 200-dimensional flipgram model as the word embedding model into which we want to impute. As a baseline, we also train fast text embeddings on the same corpus. Fast text represents words as n-grams of their constituent characters and is known to generate reasonable word embeddings for out-of-vocab terms. It's also known to perform roughly on par with BERT models for biomedical word pair similarity tasks. Fast text therefore serves as a strong baseline to compare our imputation performance. Now that we've trained the word embedding models, we can proceed to perform LSI. However, since we start from a knowledge graph instead of a domain embedding space, we need to extend the original LSI procedure by first creating the domain space from the knowledge graph as follows. We start with the full 2021 mesh knowledge graph containing around 2.3 million nodes and 4.3 million edges. We simplify the graph by only retaining nodes of type topical descriptor, as well as directly connected nodes of type concept. We also discard relationship type and directionality. This yields an undirected graph of roughly 59,000 nodes and 113,000 edges. We then create 200-dimensional node embeddings using the node-to-back algorithm. Finally, we use these domain-specific node embeddings together with our word embeddings, to perform the LSI algorithm as previously explained. We now have a single embedding space with representations for the out-of-vocab words which we can evaluate. Here we show the results of our experiments. We show the Pearson correlation between the human and embedding-based scores for each of the different models and for the different word pair subsets, both for the similarity test set on top, as well as for the relatedness test set on the bottom. The error bars are the standard deviation from 1000 bootstrap resamples of the test set. What we find is that the representational power of LSI on novel vocabulary is competitive. The LSI-based model in blue performs better than fast text in orange on the word pairs containing only imputed words, the imputed subset, and modestly better on the mixed word pairs, imputed trained. We also compare performance against a simple baseline shown in red, which directly combines the trained word embedding, skipgram filtered, and the node embedding mesh without using LSI. This baseline instead directly uses the node embeddings for the imputed terms, but applies a global rotation to align them with the word embedding space. This rotation is calculated using a singular value decomposition of the anchor term embedding matrices in the two spaces. Note that this baseline coincides with the LSI model on the trained subset, and with the mesh embedding model on the imputed subset, and we therefore only show the results for the imputed trained category. We see that the simple baseline is surprisingly competitive, but that LSI can perform slightly better. An interesting additional insight was that the LSI-based model obtains better scores than the underlying mesh node embeddings shown in green across most word pair categories. This proves that the similarity information directly encoded in the domain embedding model does not limit the similarity information encoded in the resulting imputed model. This is intuitively plausible, since LSI combines the global structure of the trained word embeddings with the local structure of the domain embeddings. Note that this is in contrast to the original LSI paper, in which the domain data alone was sufficient to obtain near-perfect scores on the evaluation task, and as such could have been used directly, thus obviating the need for LSI. In light of these results, we can make a few comments on the main strengths and weaknesses of our approach. On the strength side, LSI can be used with a wide variety of domain features. The only condition is that we can infer a distance measure between entities. LSI does also not rely on modifying the word embedding training procedure. This is particularly useful in cases where we do not have access to the training data. LSI allows word embeddings to be improved on demand for specific rare or out-of-vocab terms. Thus, it provides full control over which part of the word embedding model to adapt. LSI can also be used to update word embeddings in light of new emerging research. On the weaknesses side, the exact node embedding model to use might depend on the domain data graph, making the node embedding model a hyperparameter which might be costly to optimize. Also, quality control of LSI seems hard, since the terms we most desire to impute are exactly the terms for which no good evaluation test sets are available. In summary, we demonstrated that a latent semantic imputation is useful for embedding out-of-vocab words in the biomedical domain. We also significantly extended the original LSI algorithm, which was previously applied to numerical domain data, which immediately yields the metric structure required by LSI to infer the KNN MST graph, as well as the pairwise distances, and showed that LSI can also be applied to cases where the domain data is itself given by a graph structure, and that in this case, the node embeddings trained on the knowledge graph can be used as the input to LSI. We'd like to point out that this last step of creating node embeddings seems necessary. In preliminary experiments, we also attempted to directly use the graph adjacency matrix and did not obtain competitive results. We would be interested to see the results of future research on LSI in several directions, including LSI being applied to other scientific domains and being applied using other richer types of domain data. For example, it could be applied to a mix of relational data and literal information, such as text labels or measurement values taken from or added to the knowledge graph. We also believe that LSI could be used to adapt existing word embedding vectors rather than outright replacing them, and so used as a process to improve existing word representations rather than just solving the out-of-vocab problem. This approach could then be called latent semantic information fusion. We thank you very much for staying with us through this presentation, and we're looking forward to answering your questions.